squeezed in, so it makes sense here. But you know, when like Patrick, when I first came here, you know, I never really truly realized the breadth of history that was incorporated here at Rock Island Arsenal, and how, or Rock Island in the Quad Cities area, I should say, and how that was so expansive across the United States. You know, by the time the bridge was completed and the Effie Afton incident occurred, most of the United States had probably heard of Rock Island or the Effie Afton, you know, because of everything that was going on here. So it's amazing how that all started. But we'll get right on into it. So the first thing I wanted to point out here is showing the western expansion of the railways. So with 1830 starting here, and just obviously very minor, going to 1840, then 1850, you can see, you know, more interconnecting of the railways across the across the eastern part of the United States, and then reaching westward. And so this was actually part of, you know, the manifest destiny was not only getting to the West Coast, but making it an efficient way of getting to the West Coast by rail. So, like they talked about, that once the bridge would be completed, the trip from Davenport to New York would be 48 hours. So if you can imagine a trip that would take, you know, depending on the roadway conditions and everything, up to multiple weeks, you know, using wagon roads and everything, you know, kind of stringing across the East Coast, that was a dramatic increase in, or decrease in the amount of time overall that you're going to be traveling. Now, this is going to 1860, and so you can see there's a number of locations where the bridge gets across the, or there's bridges that get across the Mississippi River here. But between 1850 and 1856, there was a race going all the way up and down the Mississippi as to who was going to be first. And you can see that, obviously by 1860, that this is expanding west, or continuing to expand westward. But why Rock Island? Why was this an important place to cross the Mississippi? Well, overall, the bridge, there was two railways. There was one, the M&M Railway, which was the Mississippi and Missouri Railway going from Davenport out to Cedar Rapids, and then the Rock Island and Chicago Railway that was sending from, obviously, Chicago to the actual city of Rock Island itself. And so it was a natural point to connect these two to expand across the river into the west. The M&M completed its line here to Davenport in 1853, while the Chicago and Rock Island completed in 1854. This was going to be an important, not only just railway connection to the East Coast, but also connecting other transportation networks, where the river access from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River was one that was a difficult travel voyage. So you could actually get a barge from the Mississippi River all the way up to Lake Michigan and further on. But this was, you know, due to water and ice and other flows, this was going to be difficult to achieve at certain times of the year. So if you could have a rail line that would connect the lake to the Mississippi River in a spot where you could have access to most of the river year-round, it was going to be an economic advantage for that area and increased advantage for supplies going east to west, or west to east in this case too. So the Rock Island Rapids also, and if you're not aware of, before the lock and dam was put in, the river in this location was 10 to 15 feet lower. So this was the actual area, or the only area on the Mississippi River that was really difficult to navigate. So with the water level being so low, that especially in low water years, you either had to navigate a very complex series of rapids that went from just west in Davenport almost all the way up to LeClaire. Or the reason why, part of the reasons why Davenport and LeClaire exist is that if it's low enough, you have to disembark your cargo and go by land from one city to the other, depending on which direction you're going, to navigate around the actual rapids themselves. So it could show you that this is an incredibly low water area, and obviously rocky going through the area because of the rapids. But this aided in a place where you could actually successfully get down to bedrock in the riverbed to put these piers in to cross the river. So there was a lot of geographic features and reasons why Rock Island was important. In 1837, Lieutenant Robert E. Lee actually surveyed the area. So it was a very accurate survey map of the rapids, of the island, and including bedrock on either side. As you can see here, this is actually a copy of his original map here, showing the rapids where this is the Colonel Davenport property here with Fort Armstrong out here, and the future bridge location right through there. Now, you have to imagine that in between 1845, when the Fort Armstrong officially closed and burned down and closed, the Army still considered Rock Island, the island itself, as part of federal inventory. Every Secretary of War going from 1845 all the way up to 1853 considered this federal property. Now, there was no garrison, there was no real maintenance of the island. They just considered it still part of the federal installation. And so it was public land. So the railway companies that were looking at the area said, well, okay, now we don't have to buy the land from anybody. We can just use a federal grant to go across the island, and it's going to be easy. And it's a narrow point in the river with the island helping to leapfrog across the river as well. So construction and controversy. So in 1853, the Illinois legislature passed basically a clause allowing the railway companies to use the Rock Island area, the actual Rock Island side, Illinois side, and then island itself. Now, the Illinois legislature didn't really have the rights to allow them to use the actual island itself because, as we discussed, that the federal government claimed that this was federal land. And it goes to say here that the Illinois legislature said that the railroad bridge company had the power to build, maintain, and use a railroad bridge over the Mississippi in such a manner as to not materially obstruct or interfere with the free navigation of the river. Now, this is the first time that somebody actually said the major issue with bridging the Mississippi was that the Mississippi, for its entire length, was free to navigation. There were no obstructions other than natural. And with wanting to build a bridge, all the river boats and anybody that used the river for either leisure travel or business were seeing this as a massive navigational obstruction. Any bridge was going to be a problem. And so this is really the beginning of this fight that you have the steamboat captains and the railroad companies fighting constantly for years about who was going to have rights to the river and who was going to have rights to either cross it or use the navigation of the river. With this allowing, or the Illinois legislature allowing the bridge to be built, construction started, like it says here, 16 July 1853. Now, you'd think that we're going to actually break ground and start putting money into this project and start constructing it. You'd think you'd clear this with the federal government, right? Well, they didn't. The railroad companies were just bound and determined we're going to cross the river here. And then only after that, they actually sent, and by the way, talking about the navigation hazards, the railroad companies ensured all river traffic that navigation was going to be minimal hazards. They were going to build this to, afford any river traffic on the island, or in the area. Now, with that said, they waited until after the bridge construction was started to actually apply to the War Department, who owned the island for the federal government, to say, well, we want a grant of land across the island. Again, they've already started construction, so it's kind of like one of those things, well, we'll ask for forgiveness, right? And so this starts one of the two of the major fights for the island, or for the bridge, with the War Department and then with the river traffic as well. So the problem with actually asking for the War Department to do this was that the Secretary of War at the time was Jefferson Davis. And there was an ongoing survey of the Mississippi and east to west railways as to where the first crossing of the Mississippi River was going to take place. Jefferson Davis, obviously being a Southerner, wanted it in the South. There were two railways that they discussed, one going from New Orleans to San Diego, one going from Memphis, Tennessee to roughly San Diego area, basically to California. And then other competing railways going further north. Now, the one that was closest to completion was the one here at Rock Island Arsenal, or I should say Rock Island. So Jefferson Davis was trying to do everything he could to stop the advancement of the railway going across the island here, because not only would it be a bridge across the Mississippi for transportation, but economic boom for the north, and also ease of access to territories further west. To, again, we're fighting the early Civil War here as to which states or which territories are going to turn into free states or turn into slave states. So if you have a railway going across in the north or south, that obviously gives them an advantage to establish those territories into free or slave. And again, Jefferson Davis, being a Southerner, wanted it to be slave, and so he was doing everything he could. So the Rock Island Rail Line, like I said, applied to the War Department. It took him 4 months for Jefferson Davis to sit on it and then finally come back denying their claim for a grant across the island. Well, the railroad companies just basically said, we're going to do it anyway. So they just kept construction going, not even pausing to wait for Jefferson Davis to say no. he got frustrated because after he told him he thought the issue was done, he said no. Well, he got reports back saying that the construction was still ongoing. So he sent a federal marshal out here to stop the construction. And it's not really, there's not a huge conclusion as to what happened, but essentially what it seems like happened is the federal marshal came out here, said stop, and then went back. And you know, they may have listened to him and then just kept on building. So nothing had stopped. Finally, Jefferson Davis with the War Department files a federal injunction with the U.S. Circuit Court of Northern Illinois to stop construction. And this is actually the thing that really ended the fight, at least with the War Department. The judge ruled, it says here, that the Army had abandoned the island since 1845 with the abandonment of Fort Armstrong. And that, in his words, that a state such as Illinois has the power to construct a public road through public lands. And that since the U.S. Army had abandoned Fort Armstrong and then Rock Island, the island itself, that this was now land belonging to the state of Illinois, and Illinois was free to do whatever they wanted since they had already granted access across the island. So Jefferson Davis really lost his last fight to stop the actual construction of the bridge at this point. And this is actually a bridge, or a drawing of the bridge in early 1856, prior to the completion of the actual bridge itself. There's no rail line actually meeting the western tip of the bridge here. So due to the court ruling, like I said, Davis lost his last fight here. April 21st, 1856, the bridge was officially completed. The first trains rolled across, and the first bridge across the Mississippi had been completed. So the North won that race. Now, the bridge consisted of 6 spans of 1,581 feet that crossed the Mississippi. And believe it or not, I mean, you think about, you know, what construction methods we had during the Civil War, or prior to the Civil War. And they actually built a swing span onto one of the Iowa side of the bridge that was able to swing, such as the government bridge does today, to allow traffic to go through, because they were trying to keep and uphold their promise to river traffic that no traffic will be stopped at this point. And so, like it says here, that the pier had a top width of 32 feet. There was actually a caretaker's house on the center pier where the swing span was in the river. So a caretaker would actually live on this island and operated the span 24 hours a day as river traffic needed. So, I mean, for me, it seems like an amazing feat to be built in 1856 in this way. Again, riverboat owners were not happy. They extended their discontent with the newspapers and then verbally. And the other side of that is that the cities of Rock Island and Davenport wanted the bridge to come through. They wanted the economic advantage of the railway plus the river traffic here. And so most of the newspapers you find in that were published were in support of the bridge and against the riverboat owners. So this sets up the stage for a coming catastrophe. But this is actually the actual 1856 line. We're across here just to the east of the current bridge. And then went across to the center of the island. If anybody knows the island, there's Sylvan Drive. And this is actually basically where Sylvan Drive is now. And then it crosses over near where the 1856 monument is, just over here by the Colonel Davenport House. And this is actually what the arsenal was shaping up to be, with the old Civil War prison camp overlaid onto it to see the evolution here. 6th May, 1856, so less than a month after the bridge opened, the steamboat Effie Afton crashed into the bridge. And we always like to say when we talk about it that there was no malintent here. The Effie Afton had never been north of St. Louis, had never filed any application or any statement that they were going to be going north on the river. There was an unknown cargo, an unknown crew on the ship. The ship was actually very expensive. It was listed about a value of about $50,000 in 1856 dollars, and was very well equipped overall. It was like the newspapers talked a lot about this in reading about the accident itself, saying that there was no reason for it to be up here. You know, why were they here? And they actually discussed. They're really conspiracy theories, right? Discussed that the boat was loaded with fuel to actually explode and burn the bridge down. So, but the Effie Afton crashed into the bridge, has enough power to actually damage the actual swing span itself, as well as part of one of the piers. All the crew gets off and then burst into flames. And it says here that the Effingham actually burned within about a half an hour all the way down to the water line. So it was a very efficient, very fast burning fire for such a nice and well stated ship. Now the owner claimed that one of the staterooms actually had a coal stove knock over in the actual accident itself, and that's what started the fire. But you'd think that if that was the case, that you wouldn't have had so much time for the crew and everybody to get safely off the ship. And there's also discussions that one of the newspapers discussed that all the cargo was unloaded off the ship prior to the fire starting. So whether that was true, I haven't been able to prove that in the newspapers. Again, we're not quite for the river traffic, so they might have been speculating on that.
Well, early May, they might not have needed heat from the...
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of things here that, you know, we try to joke that no malintent in any way. The boat owner had a perfectly legitimate reason being up here for absolutely no reason. The bridge was damaged beyond. The bridge was damaged to where there's no no rail traffic going across it anymore. And this is actually the St. Louis newspaper off to the right announcing the actual accident itself. Oh, I'm sorry. The vessel burned. It said the vessel burned to cinders within 5 minutes. Other accounts say closer to 30 minutes, which it seems more logical in this case. But despite the extensive damage to the actual bridge itself, between May and September 8th is all it took to actually repair the bridge and get it up and running. So for the railroad companies, other than costing more money, it really was not that much more effort to repair the bridge and get it back up and running. And obviously, if you're being motivated by cash flow, is that they've now invested all this money in building the bridge, they want the rail traffic to go across the bridge to regain their, or recoup their investment here. Yeah. So, like I said, Captain John Hurd, the owner of the Effingham, decided after the accident, and the boat was insured, so we did get money back from that he decided to file suit with the U.S. District Court at Chicago, demanding damages from the railroad companies for the boat as well, because of a loss of navigation to the river. Now, the actual description as to what happened was that the boat came up through the swing bridge, came up about 100 to 150 yards, it says. Other accounts say closer to about a half mile. One of the, it had two motors, or two steam engines. One of the engines lost power, and so it only had one paddle wheel on the back functioning. And so the boat listed to the right after coming through the lock, and the boat owner description said because of the eddies and the weird water flows that the bridge caused, it sucked the boat back into the bridge, causing the damage. Now, as we'll find out later, that wasn't necessarily the case. He argued that the ship was forcibly driven by the currents and eddies into the bridge itself. So, hence the start of the Hurd v. Rock Island Railroad Company case. So now it's the second national news case about the bridge. The first one being the one that Jefferson Davis had applied the injunction for with the district court. This one now about the risk to transportation in the area. And it was promised to be the battle of the century, as the newspapers talked about. So with that said, the railroad companies are looking for a good lawyer, and a good friend of one of the two owners of the railroad company was Abraham Lincoln. He'd been getting more notoriety, he was a good lawyer, and was well known for his interest in the river itself. And believe it or not, prior to this case, he actually had fought and defended cases for river traffic and steamboat traffic. So he knew both sides of the argument itself. And he also knew the beauty of the river. He had traveled up and down the river quite extensively. Norman B. Judge, general counsel for the railroad company, said that Lincoln was one of the best men to state a case forcefully and convincingly that I'd ever heard. And his personality will appeal to any judge and jury, and it goes on in the nation. So from 1852 to 1860, he handled cases for Illinois Central Railways itself. So he knew the railroad side of it, he knew the river side of it as well. Now it's interesting actually reading the casework. The actual case documents have been damaged or destroyed by the Chicago fire, but there's other information as far as newspaper reports and other things that were going on to lead us to understand what had occurred actually in the court case itself. But prior to the case starting, Lincoln actually came here and did extensive surveys of the bridge, extensive surveys of the river. And what he mentioned in here using actually Robert E. Lee's survey map of the actual river itself. He did scientific experiments where he actually had small barges and logs flowed down the river to see the speed of the water at the various times of the day. It did studies about the eddies and everything that the boat owner had claimed that had damaged the bridge. He did these surveys to try to understand all the circumstances around the river traffic's issues around the bridge itself. And it was said that in the actual court case, he built a scale model, or he had somebody build probably, a scale model of the area, the Rock Island and Davenport area with the bridge, and including a scale model of the boat. So everybody could tell their story of what they had seen for the witnesses, and the boat owner and everybody on the boat as well could account their stories. Now, while he did a well-executed court case and well-executed discussions with the court itself, it did end up in a hung jury. So it wasn't, obviously it went on, it was appealed all the way up through, up to the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court case actually held this case in 1862, so obviously Lincoln had parted ways with this court case after the hung jury, as he was otherwise occupied in 1862.
You got a mistake there. It wasn't this case that went to the Supreme Court. It was a Ward case that went to the Supreme Court.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, because the Ward case was a separate case altogether.
Yeah, but the overall argument that he had started of freedom of traffic over the river, or freedom of navigation over the river, was where he had started it. So, you're correct. There was a litany of other cases that happened between the 1850. The initial case that Lincoln argued, and then the one that actually got to the Supreme Court. So yes, you're correct. Thank you. But the Supreme Court case itself established the right of way for river traffic, saying that if you have any bridge in the United States now, they still go roughly by this case here. So that if there's river traffic coming down the river, the bridge actually has to open for the river traffic and allow or stop all other traffic. So in this case, the train traffic, or if any of us get stuck at the government bridge, we can thank Abraham Lincoln for getting us stuck there to starting this argument anyway. And obviously, going to the Supreme Court, it gets it further muddied as to connection to this case itself. But and like I said here, that he did use the river survey maps by by Robert E. Lee. So it's funny how the world's coalesced, by the time he got to president. So going on past 1856, so obviously the bridge was repaired by September, and it was in full operation. And both sides of the river were already seeing the economic advantage of the river traffic, of the railroad traffic itself going across. But this is a good picture from 1868. Between 1856 and 1868, the bridge was damaged a number of times. A couple of times minorly by ice. One time of ice where it actually pushed one of the center piers in the island, or on the bridge further downstream, so it had to be repaired. This one's actually a picture from storm damage from a tornado. You can actually see the swing span. I don't know if this was in the case where they're actually repairing it, but the swing span is missing in this picture here. But you can see actually the lockkeeper's house here, but you can see the extensive pier running down the center to control the actual swing span itself. And this is actually looking from the Davenport side, just east of the bridge. Just west of the bridge, with Rock Island in the background back there. So any questions about anything at this point? I know there's been a lot of information, so I apologize. But replacement and deconstruction. So between 1856 and 1868, like I said, the bridge was damaged a number of times. Now the arsenal was starting to, having been established in 1862, was starting to actually get up and running. A lot of the original stone shops like we're sitting in today were starting construction. Some manufacturing had started by that point. And it actually had already been talked about since 1865, bridge, that both Davenport and Rock Island wanted to have a more streamlined approach to the bridge itself. And so they wanted to move the bridge further west on the island. So go back real quick to the map here. This is an 1865 dated map, and like I said, showing the 1856 bridge. What it says here that you can't read is proposed location of new railroad bridge. So they were wanting to move it further west, with Fort Armstrong being here, the clock tower Fort Armstrong being right here with the clock tower right there. So in 1865, this discussion had already started. So it's not that many years after the bridge had been completed. By 1872, the new new iron rail and wagon bridge had been constructed. So remember the 1856 bridge was just rail only, and just a single line for rail cars. So they wanted to actually have a public transportation bridge where you could take wagons across the bridge as well. And I'm not trying to get distracted, but everybody, if you know, with the new iron bridge, it's a double-decker bridge like it is today. And the reason why the trains are on top was that the original design of the bridge was they didn't want the wagons to be above the trains, to have the steam come up through the floor of the actual bridge itself to scare the horses. So that's why we still today drive on the lower, one of the reasons why we still today drive on the lower section of the bridge itself. But the deconstruction was difficult. So as you can imagine, that now the new bridge is built. There's no traffic over the old bridge. The old bridge had been damaged beyond repair in about 1868, 1869. So there were a couple of years where there was spotty transportation through the area. But once the new bridge was built, the railroad companies had basically abandoned the old bridge. They're like, well, now it's the Army's problem. It's not our problem anymore. And so there's this raised embankment going across the island itself where the old bridge was still located. And then they did take care of the piers going across the river to maintain the freedom of navigation and open transportation through the river in this area. However, the bridge span going from the island itself to the Rock Island, the city of Rock Island, was still there. The piers and then the structure was somewhat still standing there. And so by 1873, May of 1873, the commander of the island, or the arsenal itself, mentions in his reports that the railroad companies were failing or refusing to tear down the old bridge. So he was writing to the War Department to ask them for power and permission to basically take ownership of the bridge, and then to force the railroad companies to deconstruct it, which they eventually acquiesced to. So they tear down all the southern span of the bridge, crossing over Sylvan Slough, so crossing from the island to the city of Rock Island itself. And he had specific requests where any bridge pier, the stone piers, or any embankments had to be 17 inches below low water, so that there be a freedom of navigation through that area as well. Yes?
So the new bridge was completed in 1872.
Correct.
Is that the current bridge we have now?
No, there was one more bridge that, so that the current bridge that we have now is actually a wider and bigger bridge itself than the original 1872 bridge. It was seen that it couldn't handle the increased cargo, and they wanted a wider bridge for the larger, newer style trains to cross over. So that was replaced later on in 1896 or 98, 96.
96.
Yes.
So the original bridge heading from the island to Rock Island, I've always wondered why it goes into Rock Island and not directly, because the main line comes from Chicago. So
Yeah.
What happened there? Did they go to Rock Island, switch back and around? Or
Yeah,
how did they navigate
it was, at least what I understand from what Flagler writes about, was that it was just the way that the city had their station set up, and so they had it swing around in a big arc kind of to cross where it was in that location. And then that was after the bridge was built. They're like, well, we should straighten it out and make it a little bit more streamlined. And so the city of Rock Island actually gave up, as far as I understand, more land to make the rail line easier to use. And then also the incorporation of a second bridge for wagon traffic to get from the city of Rock Island to Rock Island Arsenal itself, to use the actual wagon bridge going across the Mississippi. So it was kind of a reorganization of the road networks there. Sorry, the long answer. Reorganization of the road networks to have both the wagon bridge and then the actual railroad bridge itself. And it never directly came out and said it, but from kind of reading between Flagler's lines in his writing, it's like, well, I think that they wanted to push the railroad, and because it's basically in the left or the west quarter of the island. They wanted to push it over to the edge of the island because they weren't sure, as the arsenal was being developed and growing, if they were going to need that land. Because when he talks about deconstruction of the bridge and then the embankment going across the island, he said, well, we want the turf that was built up for the embankment to be returned to the island itself so they could build buildings on it. So I think they were planning that the entire island was going to be used by the arsenal at some point. So that was part of the discussion too. Because obviously in 1856 they weren't worried about an arsenal being built here. And I don't think the railroad companies were worried about much other than their own interest. The road companies did come through and deconstruct most of the structures on the south side of the island itself. Now this picture is actually looking from Rock Island Arsenal itself over to the city of Davenport. And it's roughly in the area where the monument is today. So if you go out to like the Colonel Davenport House, you actually see a stone structure. And the stone structure is actually from about this portion of this pier here. It was deconstructed and then moved into the current location where the monument is, showing where the original crossing of the bridge goes. Now this picture, it looks a little difficult here, but the darker lines are from a 1989 survey of Rock Island Arsenal, showing this is the new, where the wagon bridge originally, or the new roadway bridge, and then this is the railroad bridge. Well, the shadows behind it are actually of the original 1856 bridge. So you can see the embankment that they built out into the actual Sylvan Slough with two stone piers, and then an embankment going from the shore of the Rock Island Arsenal out to support the bridge going over the slough. And so these are overlaid on each other. Yes?
Does your map go up Sylvan Slough anymore?
It does.
That curve right below the power dam, you know, where the slough splits?
Yes.
What's that old bridge abutment that's sticking on that point? What was that? Was that ever a bridge or?
That was the
The-
rail
well,
car.
That was a Tri-City Railway bridge.
Yep,
Yeah, that was a streetcar bridge.
yep,
About 44th Street, give or take.
yeah,
Yeah,
right about there.
Yeah.
So, but the drawings that go further up the river are the 1989 drawings. The original drawings for the 1856 bridge stop, I think, just shortly after this image stops here. But pointing north as well, it's just showing the overlay here. So one of the questions that we were asked as the ASC History Office was actually find the original embankments for the 1856 pier. Because once it was taken out, basically all record of exactly where they were has been lost. And so what we did with the help of the Rock Island Fire Department, they have a boat that actually has side scan sonar out there on it. And so we went out there to map this whole area where the original bridge might have been. And these are the points that were the most interesting that we found here. And then the green line is approximately where that bridge line, the 1856 bridge was. And so with these pictures, and it's a little dark to see, you see 66, 67, 68 actually shows a raised bed in the location where the embankment was, and then in this picture here actually has a hard, large object sticking out from the riverbed. Now you have to keep in mind that with the power dam that's going in, the flow going through this area is slightly decreased, and so you'll have more tendency to have sediment building up to cover a lot of these areas. But there is still a very noticeable rise in this general area where the embankments were, and then obviously a hard structure that nothing else has ever been built there. That is in theory about 24 inches under what low water should be in this area. So we feel fairly confident that we were able to find the original location of the bridge itself. And then these are continued pictures showing 70, 71, and 72 in sequence here. And 72, you can actually see the current bridge piers here, along with the roadway bed buildup where the current bridge piers are actually built on the old embankment that they built for the 1856 bridge, going right in this location right here. So we feel fairly confident that we were able to find conclusively where the bridge was going through, because River Action had actually asked us, they want to build another monument on the Sylvan Slough side to monument or to memorialize the full span of the first bridge across the Mississippi. And so with that said, I know that was going quick through a lot of very deep subject, but any questions on the 1856 bridge?
Is this Flagler that's mentioned, is this the guy that was involved in the bridgeway to Key West?
No, that was actually his brother.
Okay.
So his brother was always civilian side of it, but Major Flagler came here and was actually General Rodman's deputy commander. And so after Rodman died in 1871, Major Flagler stepped up to take charge of the arsenal. And reading through he wrote a history of Rock Island Arsenal for his time there, and as much as he knew going back. And he was handed a huge load of responsibility, because the arsenal just started construction, and now he's having to deal with all these issues with the bridges and the conflicts of the river traffic and everything. So it was his brother for the one in Key West.
I was just curious because the construction methods seem to be very similar.
Yeah, well, I guess in this case, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? The brothers were both kind of engineers. But the funny thing was, Major Flagler was an ordnance officer, so he wasn't an engineer. But he was very good at least in his writings, making it sound like he knows exactly what he's talking about. So,
It sure does.
yeah.
The problem between the boats and the railroad navigation, didn't they have the same problem out east earlier in the 40s or 30s? Didn't they have bridges over the eastern rivers and?
I'm sure they did. I'm not aware of anything where they had discussions over river traffic, but it had to have been a problem at some point. But I think the thing that made this so unique was that the amount of river traffic that was moving up and down the Mississippi River. Because you look at, like the extensive canal ways further north in New York area, that they were all built specifically to allow the river traffic. And so there was no impediment to the river traffic itself. So maybe it was just that they weren't as noticeable and there wasn't as much traffic in the standard rivers as they are here. So, but it's, at this point, by 1856, the Mississippi had always been known for its steamboats and its river traffic, and it's basically the heart for the United States for commerce going anything east or going into basically the Midwest as we know it today. So, yes.
So what year was the current bridge completed?
1896.
1896.
Yeah.
Pretty old.
Yeah, and so it's talking to the Corps of Engineers down there, it's the statistics for the bridge are just incredible. Where they talk about that it's only about 15% of its full structural capacity is being used, and they've mentioned too that on the actual swing span itself, that it's so well balanced and so machining is so well made, is that on a strong wind day, the driver or the controller of the swing span can actually take his feet off the brakes and the swing span will open on its own, just in the wind. So I mean, to imagine for something that was built in 1896. Now the bridge just prior to it, the 1872 bridge, believe it or not, in 1872 was a total cost of about $350,000. So I guess I never equated it to today's dollars, but I mean it seems like such a small amount for such an incredible bridge, and then for them to reconstruct it and build the current bridge to handle all rail traffic that's lasted over well over 100 years. So, yes.
So why can't our current engineers out there learn from this bridge, our current bridge, and be able to upkeep the Centennial Bridge, the I-74 bridge, and others, instead of tear down and build a new one, when here this bridge has been in place and in use all these years, and
it's a good question. I always try to stick to things historically accurate, so historical, but
takes care of it better? I don't know.
I think that it was just so over designed, over constructed, was that it's been able to last the test of time.
Cost of
The reason
materials.
it's overconstructed is because the first one, Congress cut the funding.
Correct. Yes.
And because they cut the funding, they couldn't build the bridge the way they wanted.
Yeah. And so it was correcting an old wrong, but then they
Corrected-
far overcorrected it. So
building it.
yeah. But and it all it's all a picture of that time and how we were wanting to concrete our further expansion west and the connections from the east and west. So yes.
Do you have any idea what the tonnage is of just the swing span?
The current one? I've seen it. Do you guys remember off the top of your head? I'd have to get back to you. But it's incredible.
Well, it's so quiet when you're standing right there with the rollers underneath and that is just amazing.
Yeah, and I apologize. I know I've read the statistics as far as the weight and everything, and then the weight capacity of the bridge overall. But yeah, it's amazing. It is so quiet and it works so flawlessly. Yes, sir.
On that first bridge that they built, what was the prime mover to make the span turn? Were they using steam at that point?
Yeah, there was. They didn't mention any actual steam motor, but they said there was a motor on it to make it turn. So I would imagine it was probably steam, unless they were really inventive and using some kind of river power.
It's kind of too early for electric.
Yeah. So it had to have been steam in that regard. But yeah, it's incredible how they said it worked relatively well. It just was in a bad location, the 1856 bridge in general. So that's, like I said, part of the reason why they moved it. But I'll have to look into that. Thank you. So yes, ma'am.
When they had to remove the pilings for the old, how did they figure the low water? How do you know how low the river's going to be?
Well, from what I read in Flagler's account, it basically talked about average low water depth. So I know that like the Corps of Engineers, even at this early point in time, or with the Corps of Engineers had been keeping accurate river measurements in the area for mainly for flood purposes, and for the 1856 bridge, they did do studies as far as river levels and where they were going to build or put the piers on mainly the Mississippi side. See, most of the documentation that we have today is everything from the island to Davenport. And so there's very little documentation we've been able to find from the island to the city of Rock Island itself. So I would imagine they had a pretty good idea of what average low water here was.
Because at that time, before they put the dam in, I understood that sometimes they can walk or drive their wagons across
Yeah.
the river there because the water comes.
Yeah, and that would be more extreme low water, as opposed to like average low water level. But yeah, and I'm sure they were aware of that. And one of the interesting things is when he's talking about this and giving out all these statements, he writes this letter to the actual railroad companies themselves, and then the railroad company, and he records this in his history of Rock Island. The railroad companies respond back, and they're talking about, well, by the time he's asking for this, it's basically winter of 1873, and they're saying, well, it's a really particularly heavy ice flow year, and we have crews out there working, but it's really cold, and we don't want to do this. And Caleb had brought it up at one point too, that the railroad companies, when they were talking to the federal government as far as the Army's concerned, they were nickel and diming the Army, where they had crews that were out, actually it was painting the bridge, right? And they were sending bills to the Army for the crews that got paint on their overalls, saying, well, the work on the bridge, painting it, caused damage to these workers' overalls, or coveralls. And so, I think that just shows kind of little bits and pieces of the communication between the railroad companies and the Army itself. And for the fact that Flagler actually had to force the railroad companies to deconstruct the actual bridge itself, I think said something as well. That, well, it's an old bridge, we don't need any more. That's your problem. And so, yes, sir.
One last question. As we're doing these 2 or 3 bridges, did the South ever get their bridge at the same time, or how long was it till the South got their
They
bridge?
did, and from what I understand, it was in about 6 months to a year after.
So,
And I think the first one was actually the Memphis line that went across the Mississippi, and then there was another one from the New Orleans line.
so it wasn't too far behind.
No, and that was what initially Jefferson Davis wasn't too concerned by the start of the bridge, because he's like, oh, we'll build ours first before theirs. But then they were running into construction problems, and obviously he wasn't quite aware of the amount of construction that had taken place here without his knowledge. So then he got a little bit worried and was trying to do all these legal actions to stop him.
But the transcontinental went to the north because Iowa had already been crossed with rail by that time.
Yes.
Now, what was interesting then was it was a very, very long time before the South got any sort of route on beyond Texas or so. They had no economic reason to do that.
Yeah, the line basically ran into Texas for the most part, and like you said, it was 1880s, I think, that
Right.
they finally got the line to connect to at least California or parts of western Arizona anyway.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so obviously the war and everything else kind of put a damper on that plan.
Well, what a lot of people don't realize too, that river was a hell of a lot narrower before they put them dams in.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of places where you're underwater now, they were working on dry land then.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's one of the things that looking at the terrain and where the bridge was built and everything, it seems like, well, this is a logical place because but it was the easiest place for them to be able to do it cost effectively. So
Well, one of the things that's not mentioned much with the bridge here was the competing bridge wasn't at Memphis, it was at Clinton. And that was a different railroad company, and that was run by different people with different ideas.
yeah,
But
and
their,
actually,
but their technology at the time didn't allow them, the longest span you could build was being built at Rock Island. And at Clinton, you needed a much longer span, and they got 2 of their sloughs crossed, but they couldn't cross the 3rd piece of water until about 1882 or 3 before they finally got the transcontinental,
Yeah.
not through Rock Island, but through Clinton.
and that's actually shown,
That's right.
at least work to that
Yep.
point. It's shown on this
Yep.
map here as well in 1860. So, but
Well, and there they were actually operating trains across the river on barges. They'd bring the train in on the Illinois side, they'd take it apart, they'd put the rail cars on barges, barge it across, and then hook it up and go on west.
yeah. So it's a fascinating history, and I mean, there's a whole, just study in, you know, the expansion of the railroads and how they looked at areas, but, you know, for our little piece of the world here at Rock Island, in the 1856 bridge is really the start of at least most of the United States at the time, knowing what was going on because of the court cases and everything, and like I said, it was truly the kind of the story of the century as far as the kind of the first O.J. Simpson or making of a murderer for the United States, or the trial going on, you know, starting here and then going obviously in many different forms up to the Supreme Court. So yes,
Where was the court actually held that Lincoln argued?
Chicago.
Chicago, that's why they lost all their records.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it was held in the Chicago archives, and it said specifically that they were lost in the city fire.
And was Douglas the other lawyer, Douglas?
What's that?
Was Douglas the other lawyer?
No, no. That would have been an interesting case. But yes, sir.
So after the court said that the Army, or they declared that the Army had abandoned the island, did anybody make an effort to purchase privately parts of the island? Did anyone try to settle on the island? Did anyone say, well, this is free land, let's get in on this while the...
The railroad companies did mention by the time the bridge was completed, there were a lot of what they termed squatters on the island, where, you know, people just moving onto the island, and I'm sure it was to a certain degree because of that, was that, well, this is free land now. But according from what I read, it's the Illinois allowance, you know, allowing the bridge to go across the island, saying that this is public land, but it's Iowa state public land now. That the Iowa would still have some kind of control or say in what was going on here. So there was nobody really, as far as I know at that time, moving on the island to start industry. It was just railroad, you know, company, and then the squatters moving on the island. But mostly, as I understand, the squatters were, you know, cutting timber and other things like that.
There were two original settlers.
Was Sears and
One
then
was Sears, and the other was.
yeah, but that was prior to the 1856 though. They were there.
See, Moline had a development on the island.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I mean, you know, there was a lot of
Evidently, they didn't have any owners.
yeah.
The
Well,
only owner was Sears, and they bought him.
correct, yeah. So there's a lot of discussion as to ownership of the island, and one of the funny things I didn't mention too is that just prior to the arsenal being established by Congress in 1862, the arsenal actually, or the island, was being auctioned by the federal government for sale. They were going to sell the actual island itself, and this was the third attempt they tried to sell the island. But the last attempt, they actually put it on the auction block, but pulled it off the morning of the auction itself. So the Rock Island became, a couple of times, became very close to being sold to private hands. But one of the things I wanted to mention to you, sir, is between 1853 and 1856, there was a nationwide survey that Congress and the War Department was helping in this as well, was to find the best routes for the Transcontinental Railroad. And this was when, like we were talking about, there were 6 routes they were looking at, you know, basically from north to south. And this was one of those routes that was discussed in the survey, and so that was part of it. And that I think that the federal government with the Army was trying to keep hands on it because it was an important spot. That even at this time in 1856, there were discussions of an arsenal. Jefferson Davis had actually talked about, before he left in 1857, had talked about an arsenal being built here because of the natural water power and all the resources that were in the area that could sustain an arsenal or an armory. So, does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah,
In a roundabout way? Anyway, so it's an interesting, yes.
When did you say Lee was here surveying?
1837.
My mother-in-law sold Big Island, part of it to the, and I read the abstract, and Robert E. Lee's signature's on that abstract, Jefferson Davis's signature's on that tract, President Lincoln's is on there, Colonel Davenport. I tried to get her to keep the damn thing and give him a quick thing, she wouldn't do it. But that piece of information is too bad somebody like you can't read it.
Yeah.
But consumers has got it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's what, again, like I said, it fascinates me about the whole area was that there were so many people that are so well known today that at that point, you know, we're not so well known. You know, like Lieutenant Lee, obviously, I don't think he had the notoriety that he would have in about 20 years, or 30 years in that case. That, you know, they all had their hands or footprints in this area. You know, Lincoln was here on the island. I don't know, I've never read about it, Jefferson Davis actually coming here at any point, so it was just, as Secretary of War, he obviously oversaw it.
That must have been something from Lee.
Yeah,
The other
but-
thing that interested me, and I don't know if Chief Blackhawk ever could write English, but his signature was in that book, and I'm not too sure that somebody did it right.
It's possible.
For him.
His mark.
Yeah. So, but other than that, well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have, but thank you for coming again to the, yeah.
I just have one quick.
Sure.
Was the bridge that was built here originally the first bridge to cross the Mississippi?
Yes. By the time the first train went across the river, it was the very first bridge to be fully constructed and for a train to go across the river
So there were no other bridges along the Mississippi?
that were completed.
First
So-
railroad bridge, correct?
Yeah, first railroad bridge.
Right.
Yes. Thank you, Jan. So, other than that, but thank you very much for coming, and please,
All right, our talk next month will be on the Italian POWs that works here on the arsenal. So if you have any interest in that, please come back. That'll be on February 4th. So I'm
Steel company was there on the island. I'm down there sometime. Sometime in the late 40s when I was because I used to go to work with them on third shift and I could well, the bridge ran out. They just rebuilt it. Yeah, that's the about us, and I'm talking a lot of people don't realize how much narrow
The railroad was already on the far side of the river before the bridge was. I'll be there
but they mostly talk about different on the branch.